Hello and welcome to Lesson 2 on definitions of abnormality. Now we've already looked at failure to function adequately and deviation from social norms. Today we're going to look at the first one, which is deviation from ideal mental health. Now Marie Jahoda, she pointed out in 1958 that we define physical illness in part by looking for the absence of signs of physical health. So if we're well, this could be indicated by having a correct body temperature, normal skin colour, normal blood pressure, etc. So if we have an absence of anything of these, then it indicates illness. Now Jahoda thought maybe we could do the same for mental illness. So she conducted a review of what others had written about good mental health, and she came up with the following 6 characteristics that enable an individual to feel happy and behave competently. These were self-attitudes, so having a high self-esteem and a strong sense of identity. Personal growth and self-actualization, so the extent to which an individual develops their full capabilities. Integration, so being able to cope with stressful situations. Autonomy, so being independent and self-regulating. Having an accurate perception of reality. And the final one, mastery of the environment, so including the ability to love, function at work and in interpersonal relationships, adjust to new situations and to solve problems. So this deviation from ideal mental health definition proposes that the absence of any of those criteria indicates abnormality and potential mental disorder. Okay, so just note here that there is some overlap between the criteria here and those that were not failing to function adequately. So for example, in both definitions, not being able to cope with stressful situations is a sign of abnormality. So to look at our AO3 points then for deviation from ideal mental health, the first point is that it's unrealistic criteria. So one of the major criticisms of this definition is that most of us could be abnormal, which is always good to know. So Jahoda presented us with ideal criteria that we certainly have, and also you have to ask how many need to be lacking before a person would be judged as abnormal. Furthermore, the criteria was quite difficult to measure. For example, how easy is it to assess a capacity for a personal growth or environmental mastery? This means that this approach may be an interesting concept, but not really usable when it comes to identifying abnormality. Now, the second point suggests that mental health is the same as physical health. In general, physical illnesses have physical causes, such as a virus or a bacterial infection, and as a result, this makes them easy to detect and diagnose. Now, it is possible for some mental disorders that you could have a physical cause, such as a brain injury or a drug overdose, but not many of them do. These are the consequence of life experiences. Therefore, it is unlikely that we could diagnose mental abnormality in the same way as physical abnormality. Now, the third point, as we've mentioned with the other two, is cultural relativism. So the same issues apply for this one as well. Many, if not most of these, are culture bound. If we apply these criteria to people from non-Western or even non-middle class social groups, we will most probably find higher incidence of abnormality. For example, the criteria of self-actualization, so actually being able to reach your potential, is relevant to members of individualist cultures, but not collectivist cultures, where individuals strive for the greater good of the community rather than the self-centred goals. Now, are there any positive things? Well, the nice thing about this approach is that it tries to find the positive and focus on the positive things rather than looking for the negative. Even though Jahoda's ideas were never really taken up by mental health professionals, her ideas have had some influence and are basically in line with some of the positive psychology movement, which is also the humanistic approach.
So the final definition that we need to learn about for abnormality is statistical infrequency. Now, this approach defines abnormality as behaviour that deviates from the norm or the average. The idea behind this approach is that the less frequently a behaviour occurs in people, the more likely it is to be abnormal. The difference between normal and abnormal then is one of quantity rather than quality. The majority of people are normal, with the minority being abnormal. The judgment of whether a behaviour is statistically frequent or infrequent is based on the mathematical principle of normal distribution. It so happens that, when measured and plotted on a graph, most human characteristics form within a normal distribution. The majority of characteristics will cluster around the middle of the graph. Any characteristic in that region would be considered statistically common. A minority of characteristics would be out at the edges, making them statistically rare and therefore a deviation from statistical norms. And you'll see an example of one of these graphs in a few slides along. So another example could be, consider a characteristic such as fear of dogs. You can ask everyone in your class to say how fearful they are of dogs on a scale of 1 to 10. Maybe not so much the puppies at the bottom of this page, but I thought it might help you remember. Most people give a figure of 5, 6 or 7. However, a few people would say 1 or 10. The 1 and 10 would be the abnormal ratings because they are not the norm. So on the graph that you can see, the one that I spoke about earlier, the graph shows the number of births per annum in England and Wales by age of mother. The line on the graph indicates a normal distribution. In a normal distribution, most people are in the central group clustered around the mean, and fewer people are at either extreme. So as you can see, it is the norm to have children at the age of around 25 to 30. Now on to our AO3 points for evaluating statistical infrequency. Our first point is that it is abnormal behaviour is desirable, or some abnormal behaviour can be desirable. The main objective to this approach is that there are many abnormal behaviours that are actually quite desirable. For example, very few people have an IQ over 150, yet we would not want to suggest that having such a high IQ is undesirable. Equally, there are some normal behaviours that are undesirable. For example, experiencing depression is relatively common, yet it is undesirable. Therefore, using statistical infrequency to define abnormality means that we are unable to distinguish between desirable and undesirable behaviours. In order to identify behaviours that need treatment, there needs to be a means of identifying infrequent and undesirable behaviours. The next point, the cut-off point is subjectively determined. If abnormality is defined in terms of statistical infrequency, we need to decide where to separate normality from abnormality. For example, we might consider the symptoms of depression. One of them is difficulty sleeping. What then counts as abnormal? We might decide that sleeping less than 80% of the population is abnormal. We might decide that abnormal sleep should be defined as sleeping for fewer hours than 80% of the population. But some people might think that that isn't sufficiently abnormal, and that 90% might be a better cut-off between abnormality and normality. And the last point is that, back to our favourite of cultural relativism again, it attempts to define abnormality in terms of social norms is bound to be relative to the group of people around them. So in this case, behaviours that are statistically infrequent in one culture may be statistically more frequent in another. For example, one of the symptoms of schizophrenia is claiming to hear voices. However, this is an experience that is common in some cultures. This means that the statistical infrequency model is culturally relative, i.e. only relates to one particular culture. Okay, that is the end now of the learning. So you've got your AO1 marked, which is going to be describing the definitions, your AO2 for the real life justifications, and your AO3 for your evaluations. So let's now see what you've learnt and try and put this knowledge into practice.